Good morning, everyone. Welcome to today's hearing. Today we're going to start hearing evidence from Mr. Peter Cowup, formerly of the London Fire Brigade. Yes, Mr. Kinnear.
May I call Mr. Cowup?
Thank you. Good morning, Mr. Cowup.
Good morning.
I gather you're going to make the oath. So would you take the testament and read the words on the screen, please?
I swear by Almighty God that the evidence I shall give shall be the truth, the whole truth, and nothing but the truth.
Thank you very much. Now, please sit down and make yourself comfortable.
Thank you.
All right. Yes, when you're ready, Mr. Kinnear.
Thanks, sir. First of all, would you please confirm your name for the record?
Peter Cowup.
Mr. Cowup, good morning. Thank you very much for attending to give evidence today. Before we start, I should say my questions are intended to be short and simple. Sometimes it doesn't work out that way. If they're long or not clear, please say so and I'll rephrase them. Secondly, if at any time you need a break, please say so. That's not a problem. Thirdly, if when giving evidence, could you keep your voice up? That allows the transcriber to capture everything you say and everything you say correctly. And finally, please don't nod in answer to a question. Say yes or no, as the case may be.
Understood.
Thank you. Now, you've made three statements for the inquiry. The first statement is dated the 16th of February 2019 and can be found at LFB 000 32784. Is that it?
That's correct.
And if we could turn to page 8. Thank you. Is that your signature?
That is indeed.
Thank you. Now, that statement exhibited, amongst other documents, an exhibit entitled PC6, which is your report entitled National Guidance and London Fire Brigade Operational Policy for Fighting Fires in High-Rise Buildings, and that can be found at LFB 000 32783. Is that it?
That's correct.
Thank you. And your second statement is dated the 8th of May 2019 and can be found at LFB 000 55248. Is that it?
Indeed.
And if we can turn to page 7, is that your signature?
It is.
Thank you. Now, in that second statement, you confirm that you drafted PC6 and you provided an affirmation that its contents are correct to the best of your knowledge. Is that right?
That's correct.
And finally, if we can look at your third statement, which is dated the 14th of October 2020, which can be found at LFB 00 11 9849. Is that it?
It is.
And if we could turn to your signature on page 116, is that your signature?
It is.
Now, there are a large number of documents exhibited to each of the three statements. Is that right?
Indeed.
And have you read, first of all, your statements recently?
I have.
Have you read the exhibited documents recently?
I have.
And can you confirm that the contents of the three statements are true to the best of your knowledge?
Absolutely.
Thank you. And are you happy for those statements and indeed your report, PC6, to be taken as your evidence to this inquiry?
Indeed.
And finally, have you discussed your evidence with anyone before attending the inquiry today?
Only my legal team.
Mr. Cowup, thank you. Now, the first topic I'd like to discuss with you today is your roles and responsibilities at the LFB. Now, you state in the first sentence of paragraph 4 of your first statement, which can be found at LFB 000 32784/2, that you were employed by the LFB between 1982 and March 2016 when you retired. Is that correct?
That's correct.
Now, you say that you were employed as an operational firefighter. Did you perform operational duties throughout your time at the LFB until you retired in 2016?
I did.
Now, you state in the final sentence of paragraph 8 of your first statement, which can be found at page 3, that in April 2009 you were promoted to Deputy Assistant Commissioner in Operational Tactics, which was a team in the Operational Policy Department. Was that your first role in the Operational Policy Department?
It was my first substantive role. Previously, I think it's mentioned earlier in my statement, I'd been an assistant divisional officer in the contingency planning team, which was part of what was called operational policy at the time.
Thank you. Following your appointment as a Deputy Assistant Commissioner, what was your experience of live incident command?
So throughout my career, obviously, I attended many incidents, both as a firefighter initially and then as a supervisory officer, up to and including Deputy Assistant Commissioner. So I did attend a lot of incidents, yes.
Thank you. It's an unfortunate phrase, but you then acted up as Head of Service and Operational Policy from the 7th of June 2013, is that right?
That's correct.
And then following that, you were promoted to Assistant Commissioner in Operational Policy from August 2014 onwards, is that right?
That's correct.
Now, did that mean that you were the effective head of the operational department between June 2013 until your retirement in March 2016?
Yes.
Now, if we can stay on page 3 of your statement, your first statement, and look at paragraph 10. In the first statement there, first sentence rather, you say this, and I quote, "My primary responsibilities in the role of AC, so that's Assistant Commissioner in Operational Policy, were to head up the department that was responsible for the creation and maintenance of approximately 80% of all LFB operational policies and risk assessments." Did that percentage include the LFB's policy on high-rise firefighting?
It did.
And when you say that the Operational Policy Department was responsible for the creation and maintenance of LFB operational policies, can I just see what, in detail, your department was responsible for? First of all, were you responsible for identifying when it was necessary to create a new policy?
Yes, although that responsibility was shared across the organisation because the source of policy, I think we've submitted to you a flowchart that shows the various drivers for policy either to be created or changed. So the source of change could come from outside of the department and indeed on occasions outside of London Fire Brigade.
So if a new or amended policy were required, the actual carrying out of the work required to implement that new or amended policy, where did responsibility for that undertaking lie?
So the department was organised into a series of teams that had a kind of thematic responsibility for different areas of operations.
But it lies within your old operations department?
Generally, but as I've said in my statement, there were areas of operational policy such as relating to transport, certain aspects of national resilience, which sat with other departments.
Because of their particular needs and sensitivities?
Mainly because of the expertise for those areas would have sat in departments other than operational policy.
And who was responsible for drafting the policy and managing the process of internal consultation that the LFB's procedures required in relation to a new or amended policy?
So the process of consultation was in different phases. So it would generally start with a peer review, which would be within the department, the owning department. After that, there would be a formal heads of service consultation. And then after that, there would be formal consultation with the trade unions through a group called Brigade Committee for Health and Safety and Welfare of Staff.
But generally, would your department be responsible for managing that process of consultation, even though there were different constituent elements to it?
My department didn't manage the process. For example, we managed the heads of service consultation for sure, and we managed the peer review. But the formal consultation with the trade unions was run through the Health and Safety Department because they administered and managed that joint committee.
To deal with a particular instance, would your department have managed the process for a revision of PN 633, the LFB's policy on high-rise firefighting?
Yes.
Now, you go on to say in the second sentence of paragraph 10 this: the department was also responsible for specifying requirements for some operational training. Now, was it the responsibility of your department to identify any training requirements that arose as a result of a new or amended policy?
That's correct.
And so if the operational policy department decided that it was necessary to create a new one or amend an existing one, it fell to your department to identify whether that new or revised policy brought with it a new or revised training requirement. Is that right?
That's correct.
Thank you. Now, having dealt with those high-level structural matters, can I now turn to the generic risk assessment process that carried out between 2010 and 2014? And I want to ask you some general questions, first of all, and I emphasise the word general, and the review of national generic risk assessments that was undertaken during that period. Once we've done that, we will then turn to the specifics of GRA 3.2.
Okay.
Now, the first topic I'd like to discuss with you this morning is generic risk assessments. What's their role and what's their purpose? And if we come on to some particular questions so I can anchor you in your report. Now, can we go to PC6 first of all, which is at LFB 000-327-83. There's your report. And if we can go to page 6 within that report. And if we could look at paragraphs 2.1.2 and 2.1.3, and you say this: GRAs, that's generic risk assessments, were provided by the DCLG, the Department for Communities and Local Government, to assist Fire and Rescue Services, FRS, in identifying and recording significant risks to their employees and others affected by their operations. FRS are responsible for ensuring that GRAs are valid within the setting of their own systems of work, and they were encouraged to use them to inform and develop their own practices and procedures. In this context, GRAs are intended to support those personnel in FRS who are responsible for creating and amending service risk assessments, operational policy and procedures. GRAs are not intended to be used directly to guide operations or to be used at incidents, although they are publicly available through the Government Gateway gov.uk website. There is no requirement for operational personnel to know about or make use of these documents, but some may make reference to them for training and personal development purposes. Now, there were a large number of GRAs when the review started in 2010, is that right?
That's correct. I believe there was in the order of 40.
That's the number we've seen, 40, and if reference were needed for that, it's PC6 at paragraph 2.2.5 on this page. Was the purpose of the generic risk assessments to provide a guide to individual fire and rescue services when preparing their own operational policies and procedures?
Yeah, absolutely. They were, they were written by seconded people from different fire services, or at least the review that I took part in, that's how that was managed. I can't speak for how they were first created because I wasn't involved. And each service took the lead and created a document that the expectation was that local fire services would then take that document and use it to inform and create their own, first of all, risk assessment and secondly, policy.
Now, we've referred to the fact of your department's general responsibility in relation to new policy and amendment of existing policy. Does it follow that the burden primarily fell on your department to be familiar with the substance of GRAs?
The way we worked in London at the time was that I was the representative for London Fire Brigade on the GRA committee, to distinguish between that, and there was also a board. And as a result, I was the conduit through which GRAs were shared with London. And my role in that respect was to either pass them out to whoever in my team was best placed to deal with them, or if they went into another department, to pass it to that head of service and to ask them to carry out a review. So there was over the course of the 2 or 3 years that the GRAs were under review, there was a constant series of reviews of individual documents as they were produced and released by CLG for consultation. So there was a 2-stage process to consult on each GRA.
Now, we'll come on to the substance of members and all the rest of it, but Would it be fair to summarise your evidence this way, that you were the GRA point man at the LFB?
That would be very fair.
Thank you. Now, could we look in broad terms at the operational guidance review programme that was carried out between 2010 and 2014? Now, if we look at paragraph 2.2.1 on this page, you say this: the GRA series was reviewed between 2010 and 2014 as part of a broader operational guidance, health and safety guidance review programme. This programme was commissioned by DCLG and the Chief Fire and Rescue Advisor, the CFRA, as the owners of this guidance. Now, did that broader operational guidance review consider all the various 40-odd GRAs?
Yes, I believe so.
And you explain just below at paragraph 2.2.2 that, and I quote, responsibility for programme management and delivery was contracted to Surrey Fire and Rescue Service. First of all, by whom was it contracted to Surrey?
My understanding is that was an arrangement between DCLG and Surrey Fire Service. I don't know the precise arrangements of the contract. I was not privy to that, but they had a seconded Surrey officer, Derek Clough, who was in effect the programme manager.
Thank you. We'll come on to Mr. Clough in due
Yeah, and
course.
I believe he was seconded for the period of that work.
Thank you. And what was the substance of Surrey's role in the broader operational guidance review programme?
I think their role was primarily one of programme management and administration. I can't recall whether, as a service, they also took on review responsibilities, because most fire services did take on one or two of the GRAs to review. London, for example, we took on two.
Okay. Now, you say that the programme was, quotes, commissioned by DCLG. What was the substance of DCLG's involvement in the operational guidance review programme?
I can't really answer that in any detail because I was never particularly aware of their active involvement. Derek Clough led the meetings that I attended. I think occasionally Chris Bolton, who was his line manager, I think he occasionally attended one or two of the meetings. But other than that, I weren't aware of DCLG staff being directly involved in the process.
Thank you. Now, following on from your evidence in relation to Mr. Clough, can we now look at the governance of the review programme, and in particular the project board and the GRA committee? Now, if we can just look at paragraph 2.2.7, which I think is at the bottom of page 6. There we go. You say there this: governance for this review process was provided by a project board and all CFOA, that's CFOA regions that involved administrations and other stakeholders were represented on a larger review committee. The board and review committee met monthly to discuss progress and discuss issues arising during the programme or associated with specific GRAs. Am I right in understanding that you were not a member of the project board?
Correct.
You provided a document kindly which, as you explain at paragraph 20 of your third witness statement, we don't need to go to it, but the reference is at LFB 00119849/8. That document identifies the board members and gives an overview of the GRA process. And if we could briefly look at that document, which can be found at LFB 00102328. Thank you. And if we can see in the first paragraph on the first page, and it's under the heading Purpose and Introduction, the document says this: this document describes the responsibility and relationship between the Strategic Management Board and the GRA Committee. Now, is the reference to the Strategic Management Board there the same as the project board that you discuss in your evidence?
I believe so.
Thank you. Now, if we can turn to page 3 in this terms of reference document, and we can see at the top the membership is set out. And we can see that that includes, and I think it's the bottom two lines, the project manager, chief fire and rescue advisor, who's Derek Clough, to whom you referred, and as well as the CLG project advisor, Chris Sewell. Derek Clough was from Surrey, but had been seconded to the CFOA unit for the purpose of the GRA review programme. Is that right?
Not the CFOA unit. I think he'd been seconded to CFRAO, the Chief Fire Rescue Advisors team.
Sorry, you're right. Apologies, that was me. And did he report to Sir Ken Knight, who was then the Chief Fire and Rescue Advisor?
I believe he reported to Chris Bolton, who in turn would have reported to Sir Ken Knight.
Thank you. And the only fire and rescue authorities that are represented are, it would appear, West Sussex and the West Midlands. Is that right?
Based on this document, I'll be honest, I had no direct involvement or sight of the board, so beyond what's said here, I can't really comment.
And if we look at the third subheading on page 3, it sets out committee members. There we go, and it sets out there in the first entry, CFOA regions, then representative bodies, the health and safety executive, and the programme manager. Is that the larger committee to which you refer in your report, PC6?
That's correct.
And you're a member of this committee representing the LFB, is that right?
That's correct.
And to be clear about the membership of this GRA committee, the country was divided into regions. So, for example, the West Midlands is a CFOA region, and West Midlands captures all the fire and rescue services within that particular area. Is that right?
I'm not sure that is correct. I think West Midlands Fire Service were part of a wider region. I think the only fire service that constituted a region was London Fire Brigade. I think all the other 9 were multiple services.
Thank you. And that answered my next question. London was its own CFOA region.
Correct.
And is it correct that a representative from DCLG also sat on the GRA committee? Can you remember now?
I honestly, well, other than I took Derek Clough to be the representative of DCLG, I don't recall anyone else from DCLG. Chris Bolton occasionally, I think, attended, and other staff may have occasionally attended, but in a routine sense. The minutes will show who was present at each meeting.
But Derek Clough was who you understood to be...
That's correct.
Representing the interests of DCLG?
Yes.
And did any member of the committee have any specific expertise in high-rise buildings or high-rise firefighting?
The committee was a mixture of operational officers like myself, so we had our operational experience. Some of those also had regulatory fire safety backgrounds and experience, so they would have brought that knowledge to the table. And the other primary membership was people that were in health and safety roles within their service. So Mark Bishop, for example, was not a uniform member of staff. He was a non-operational member of staff with, I believe, a health and safety background. We also had the health and safety executive there, and obviously, as it says, the trade unions.
Did you have much to do with Chris Sewell in terms of your work on the committee?
I didn't know.
Were you satisfied that the committee had the right spread of expertise and experience to consider the GREs that fell to be considered?
My experience was that the committee had knowledgeable officers. Whether we had the completely right mix, I'm not sure it was my place to make that judgment, but certainly the people I met and interacted with were professional officers. They clearly were experienced officers, so they would have had the right skills and knowledge and understanding for the topics that we were being asked to consider.
Put it slightly differently, did you ever have a concern that there were any gaps in the knowledge or expertise of the committee members?
No.
Thank you. Can I turn on to a separate topic now, which is responsibility for GRAs? And for this, can we go back to PC6, which can be found at LFB 000 32783/7. And if we look at paragraph 2.2.9, you say this: members of the review committee also took responsibility for leading on the production of one or more revised GRA. although this did not always mean that they were the authors of these documents, and in some cases that role was undertaken by personnel from another FRS in the nominated region. Now, in relation to GRA 3.2, the review of which we know you were appointed to lead, there was no involvement from any other fire and rescue service or indeed any other CFO region. Is that right?
That is correct, although I am aware from minutes of GRA committee meetings that originally the intention was for other services, Scotland I believe being one of them, to be involved. But for reasons that I'm not able to share with you because I wasn't involved in the decision making, when it come to the point of review, it was given to London alone.
Okay. And if the reference is needed for anyone following, it's paragraph 29 of your third witness statement, which is at LFB 00119849/17. And am I right in understanding that you were primarily assisted by Philip Morton from the LFB, with some minor involvement from other individuals at the LFB? Is that, in broad terms, is that right?
That's correct.
And Mr. Morton was a station manager in the operational policy department at the time of the review. Is that right?
That's correct.
And so he reported to you?
His line manager was someone in my team, but yes, he was part of my team.
Thank you. And as between you and Philip Morton, who was his line manager?
I think originally it would have been someone called Malcolm Ettridge. After that, Spencer Alden-Smith. He was part of the fire policy team.
And we'll come on to email correspondence involving those gentlemen in due course. But as between you, Philip Morton, Mr. Ettridge and Mr. Alden-Smith, who decided the direction in which to take GRA 3.2?
The original work, in terms of the early drafts, was very much driven by the lessons that had been identified through the Lakanal House fire, of which people in the policy team, myself included, were familiar. Beyond that, as the document matured, it was very much driven by the consultation responses that we received from all the people that were consulted upon.
The initial thinking, though, about what direction to take GRA 3.2 in, had you...
Well, the initial...
If you let me finish the question.
Sorry.
Had you, Mr. Morton and the others, coalesced around the view that the starting point would be the lessons learned from Lakanal?
I think the best way to characterise it is that the starting point for the document was version 2. So we weren't starting from a blank sheet of paper. So we obviously were we made ourselves very familiar with that document because we didn't want to lose the learning that had already been crystallised as a result of that document being created. One of the things I felt quite strongly was that the order of material would benefit from being changed. So we adopted a more chronological approach to the way in which we describe the control measures. In terms of the initial learning and recognising that the Lakanal House fire was the reason why GRA 3.2 version 3 was being reviewed again, because unlike all the other GRAs, it had been reviewed in 2008. Clearly, it was important that we captured all of the Lakanal House fire learning, so as a starting point. But I was, in due course, obviously very much aware that there was Shirley Towers and there were other incidents that we needed to pick up from.
Thank you. That's very helpful. Now, you're clear in your third witness statement that it was the Department for Communities and Local Government, as it was then called, that retained overall control over the publication of the GRA series. Is that a fair summary?
That's absolutely the case.
Now, and just so that you and people watching can see what you say in your witness statement, if we can go to LFB 00119849/17. If we look at paragraph 28 in its first sentence, you say this: the DCLG owned and were responsible for the content and publication of the whole of the GRA series. And if we look at the first two sentences of paragraph 32, which is just over the page, you say this: in the course of this review, the feedback received was either assimilated into the text of GRA 3.2 or rejected, in which case a rationale for this decision was provided to the contributor. Whilst I was responsible for that process, final editorial control of GRA 3.2 and all other GRAs rested with DCLG. Now, who did you understand to be ultimately responsible for the content of GRA 3.2?
In personal terms, or
Deal with the corporate body first.
DCLG.
And within DCLG, who had the responsibility of final sign-off?
I don't believe this was written down, but I would have, if you'd have asked me then, I would have said it was the Chief Fire Rescue Advisor would be the ultimate authority. Possibly the board as well, the lead on the board, Sean Roof. He may have, in practical terms, he may have taken the day-to-day decision-making were there to be any kind of dispute or issue about content.
And when you say board, it's the GRA board you're referring to there?
Yes.
Now, to what extent were you anticipating at the start of the review that DCLG would be substantively involved in the review of and the revisions made to GRA 3.2?
I'll be honest, I didn't really have any preconceived ideas. I hadn't participated in this work previously, and there were no detailed guidance documents explaining how the process would work. I understood it was a collective effort, that there was, as I say, two main phases of consultation, that we as the lead brigade would take responsibility for drafting, and that the committee and the board and CFRAO ultimately would agree or not whether the content was appropriate.
Did you have any sense of the operational knowledge, expertise and experience on the part of the Chief Fire and Rescue Advisor and his unit?
Well, I knew him personally, when it was Peter Holland, and I think it was Peter Holland for most of the time that I was working on this.
I think you're right.
And I knew him personally as a result of having acted as a liaison officer during the industrial disputes. So I knew Peter Holland to be a very experienced and very knowledgeable fire officer.
Did you have any knowledge of the experience and expertise of other officials within the Chief Fire and Rescue Advisor's unit on operational matters?
I knew some of them as a result of having been involved in the London 2012 preparations and delivery, because they used to be involved in the National Coordination Centre for the Games. So I did have personal knowledge of them, and I knew them to be generally experienced and knowledgeable fire officers.
You used the word generally there. Were there any exceptions to that view that you formed?
Not particularly, no.
Now, were you, and we're talking now at the start of the review process itself, were you aware of any intention on the part of the department the responsibility for operational guidance documents, such as the GRA series we're looking at today, should eventually be transferred to the sector, let's say fire and rescue services, rather than landing with government?
I think when I started, if those discussions were taking place, they were taking place at a level above me. I was aware towards the end of the programme that the intention was for the sector to take responsibility and control, but for the bulk of the time that I was working on GRA 3.2, I was very clear that it was CLG that we were working for, and my understanding was that the GRAs, because they were at a very late stage of development, by the time that sector transfer was actually taking place, that at no time did responsibility for the GRA pass to the sector.
Thank you. Sir Ken Knight, in his second witness statement to the inquiry, said that it was agreed in 2012 that the LFB would take over responsibility for the operational guidance programme as part of this sector-led approach. Were you aware of that decision in 2012 to transfer responsibility from DCLG effectively to the sector?
I don't recall being aware of it in 2012. I certainly became aware of it later on. as I said just now, I don't believe that ever included the GRA series. So I think that was more in the context of national operational guidance and the guidance documents that CLG had produced alongside GRAs.
Would it be fair to say, therefore, that given that GRA wasn't part of that transfer of responsibility, it had very little, if any, effect on your work on the GRA programme?
I'm sorry, what had little effect?
The transfer of responsibility from government to the sector.
It was going on in the background. It made no material difference to what I was doing.
Can you remember now who within the LFB was intended to be responsible for managing the operational guidance programme once it had been transferred?
My recollection was that in day-to-day terms passed to Susan Ellison-Bunce, and she was head of strategy and performance is the department I think it was called at the time, and I think she was the person who was going to manage national operational guidance.
And so it wasn't a ball that fell into the court of your department?
No. At that stage, we were very much aware of it and we had discussions with them. I was very keen for London's policy portfolio to play its part in shaping national guidance.
And why was that?
I'm sorry.
Why were you keen?
Because I felt we had a very comprehensive and detailed set of policies that would assist both other services and the programme itself to deliver a viable product.
Now, Sir Ken went on to say in his witness statement, and we don't need to go to it, but the reference is HOM 0005080/3, and it's paragraph 11 and the final two sentences. He said, in relation to the LFB's taking responsibility of the programme, he said this: it was agreed that NOGPB, so the National Operation Guidance Project Board, I think
that's correct,
and NOPG would remain until a revised structure of strategic governance was put in place in 2012. The Minister and CFRA would remain responsible for the final sign-off and publication. So when Sir Ken says that the Minister and the Chief Fire and Rescue Advisor were to remain responsible for the final sign-off and publication, do you know if that was intended to be on an interim basis, pending, as he says, implementation of a revised structure?
My understanding for GRAs, and I'm not speaking about any other kind of national guidance, was that would remain with CLG throughout.
Thank you. Now, if we can turn to the review process itself. Now, in terms of the process that it was intended would be followed for each GRA, you've exhibited a document that you state was circulated by Lee Brinton, that's Leigh Brinton, to members of the GRA committee in July 2011. Now, before we look at that, am I right in understanding that Lee Brinton is from Surrey, FRS, which was, as we discussed, responsible for the overall management of the review programme? That's
correct. She was brought into the programme to provide administrative support.
And if we can look at the document that she circulated, which is LFB 00102-584, now, if we can go through, you'll see a number of milestones, to use their description, are contained in this document. And the first one is on the left-hand side, third box down, in bold. And it's recorded as intended to take up 20 working days. Now, that is the production of the draft GRA by, quotes, the GRA owner, regional GRCM, in consultation with rep bodies and other relevant groups. First of all, regional GRCM was what or whom?
I honestly don't know.
Was the GRA owner, whichever CFOA regional representative on the committee had taken responsibility for leading on any particular GRA?
Yeah, and I recognise throughout my involvement in this process that the term owner has been a point of possible contention. So I think, to be really clear, what I understood that to mean in this context was the fire service or region, to be more accurate, that was taking responsibility for drafting.
So taking the lead on drafting.
Taking the lead on drafting would be a much more accurate way to describe it.
And does therefore, in light of that, does the phrase regional GRCM simply mean the regional GRA committee member, do you think?
It could well do, yeah.
Or put differently, can you think of any other possible plausible explanation for that abbreviation?
I can't. I mean, I was very clear of what I was expected to do, and that clarity extended to the fact I knew I wasn't owning the document. I was a caretaker. I was the person taking the lead on drafting it. I didn't own it. I wasn't taking final decisions regarding it.
And by owner, I want just to make that absolutely clear, you mean the person who's responsible for the final sign-off. Is that fair?
Correct.
Thank you. Now, who are the rep bodies referred to here in milestone 1?
So the rep bodies is representative bodies, Fire Brigade Union, the retained Firefighters Union, and the Fire Officers Association are the 3 trade unions that I believe were represented on the panel, the committee.
Now, looking at how it's set out and explained here, milestone 1 appears essentially to be an initial period of consultation with the identified representatives conducted in theory over 20 working days. Is that a fair summary?
That is a fair summary, yes.
Can you help us? Who were the vaguely described other relevant groups?
I think that probably would have varied region to region.
Is there anyone the lead thinks needs to be spoken to or consulted, basically?
Yes, and in certain cases, I'll give you a concrete example. We also led on the lift and escalator GRA, and for that document, we did consult with the relevant trade body. So that's an example of who the relevant group might be outside of the fire service, depending on the topic and the issues to be discussed.
In relation to GRA 3.2, can you remember now who the other relevant groups might have been that you consulted for the purposes of milestone 1?
Well, because we were a region in our own right, it was primarily within LFB.
Thank you. Now, following that, on the left-hand side, 4th box down in bold, we see that circulation of the draft GRA by the project manager to all other regional GCRMs, rep bodies and devolved administrations for consultation, and that would take a further 5 days. The project manager was, as you say, Derek Clough, is that right?
That's correct.
And who were the other regional GCRMs, the relevant leaders on?
It would be the people that were named in the committee, but I think for the sake of accuracy, the committee was subject to a fair amount of churn, so the membership did change quite frequently, as would be the case with these kind of bodies.
Now we can see the next emboldened box is milestone 2. That's the 5th box down in bold, which is recorded as taking another 20 working days to complete. That's the point at which the receiving regional GCRM was intended to distribute the draft GRA to their region's Health and Safety and Ops Committee team members for consultation. Now, who is the receiving regional GRCM for these purposes?
So my understanding of that's the committee member that wasn't involved, or the regions that weren't involved in the drafting work. So they would take the draft and ensure that all the fire services within their region were cited on it. It's giving some prompts there as to the fact you should put it in front of your health and safety department, as well as your operational policy and operational planning departments, so that you've got a well-rounded appreciation of the topic.
Thank you. And the next stage is milestone 3, again on the left-hand side, 6th box down, and that was to take 5 working days. And at that stage, the GRA owner was to collate consultation returns and forward the draft to the GRA author. Now, can you help us, at risk of getting excessively procedural and formalistic, what's the difference between the GRA owner and the GRA author?
It's a very good question. I suspect that in some regions there was a difference between who was representing the region on the committee and who was actually working on the GRA. So I know in many cases it wasn't the service that attended the meetings that did the work.
So looking at using the specific example of GRA 3.2, the GRA owner and the GRA author would appear to be the same person, is that right?
That's correct.
Thank you. Now the next stage, immediately below milestone 3, was consideration of the consultation returns by the GRA author, an amendment of the draft GRA taking into account those responses, and that was intended to take 10 working days, is that right?
That's correct.
And if we can turn to the right-hand side in the top box, a further 5 days were allowed for the GRA project manager to, quote, check, close quotes, the draft and either send it back to the GRA author for further work, or it's dispatched to, quote, key stakeholders for national consultation. Now, just to remind ourselves, the project manager was Mr. Clough. And the next question is, who were, quotes, key stakeholders for national consultation? Using the specific example of GRA 3.2 is probably the most helpful.
My understanding of the term, it primarily was UK fire services, obviously also trade unions, health and safety executive, and then I guess it would have been anyone else that the project manager deemed appropriate for the topic that was under review.
Thank you. Now, after the start of national consultation, we come to milestone 4, which you see is still on the right-hand side. That was when stakeholders would be canvassed as part of the national consultation. Is that right?
Yes, that's when the document went back out. The distinction, it's a difficult thing on reflection to explain this, because the first stage of consultation was via the regions and via the people directly involved. And I think for clarity, the second national consultation was more or less a repeat of the same thing, but it was directed to chief fire officers rather than the regional reps.
That's helpful. Thank you very much.
And you'll see the letter that reinforces that for 3.2.
Thank you. Because impressionistically, taking it around, it looks as if the national consultation is effectively replicating the earlier initial consultation round.
I think that's a very fair way to characterise it.
Okay. Milestone 5. This was consideration by the GRA owner author of the feedback received from the national consultation and making any consequential amendments to the draft before he sent it back to the project manager. Is that right?
That's correct.
And 10 days again is allowed for that.
Yes.
Now, following that, there's another 5 days allowed for the GRA project manager to check, in quotes, the final GRA draft again, and then send it to the Department of Communications, DOC, and prepare the GRA for publication. What was the Department of Communications?
I believe that was a group within DCLG that I think we might know them as Her Majesty's Stationery Office. I think it was the typesetters, the people who took the draft, which was generally created in Word, and turned it into the format that they used for publication.
Thank you. Now, the process seems to anticipate a period of 100 days from production of the first draft GRA to dispatching it for publication. Does that accord with your recollection of the time frame? Of what was intended, anyway?
It accords with what was intended. I think practice proved that was incredibly optimistic, and GRA 3.2 took considerably longer than that.
We'll come on to that in due course.
Of course.
Yeah. And that process involved, as we discussed, a period of regional as well as national consultation, with feedback from both those processes being fed into the final draft. Is that right?
Correct.
Looking at it, as it's summarised here, there is no substantive role for DCLG. Is that a fair observation, both as to what's set out here and what in practice happened?
My understanding was that where it says GRA project manager, that's a way of saying CLG.
And so when it's referred, the verb that's used is to check.
Yes.
Those are the two instances where that's used. That was where CLG would become substantively involved.
Very much so.
Via Mr. Clough.
So they were clearly responsible for the quality assurance of the final product and of the, not just the final product, but of the emerging product at these two consultation stages.
When you say quality assurance is one of those vexed phrases that may have different meanings, what did you understand quality assurance to mean in practice in terms of the CLG's role here?
I'm reflecting on it now rather than what I thought about it at the time.
At the time, what were you anticipating CLG to be doing?
I would have anticipated that they would have ensured the document was fit for purpose, that it was accurate, current, complete.
And coherent, presumably.
And coherent, of course.
So they were taking the step back and ensuring that it was consistent, practical, and capable of enforcement on the ground. Is that a fair summary, do you think?
Well, enforcement on the ground may be going a step too far because it was never intended to be used by the front line at incidents. It was there to guide people writing local policy. But yes, to make sure that it was fit for that purpose, absolutely.
So practicable for those with
Practicable, yes.
Thank you. Can we turn on to the specifics of GRA 3.2?
Of course.
Now, you set out in your third witness statement, it's probably useful to go to it, LFB 00119849/9. We look at paragraph 22.1. You say there that it was agreed at a meeting of the GRA committee on the 14th of July 2009, so very shortly after the Lacknell House fire on the 3rd of July 2009, that, and quoting from the minutes of the meeting, I quote, "Following the recent fire in Camberwell, London, involving a high-rise residential block of flats, DC has been asked if the GRA review team could prioritise a review of the current high-rise GRA." Now, DC presumably is Derek Clough, is that right?
That's correct.
Now, that excerpt indicates that the review of GRA 3.2 was prioritised as early as the 14th of July 2009, and specifically in response to the Lacknell House fire. Is that a fair reading of people's thinking?
That's certainly a fair reading of the note. I'm not sure that I was present at that meeting. That would have been around about the time that I joined the group. My predecessor, a gentleman called Neil Phoeben, may have attended that meeting. I can't recall whether I was there or not, because I've picked up on the reference to East Region and Scotland as a result of preparing for this, but I wasn't aware that they were going to be part of it. And certainly when I became involved, it was London that was going to lead.
But you've got no reason to doubt that it was the fact of the Lacknell fire which gave the prioritisation to the work on GRA 3.2?
No, none at all.
Thank you. Now, the excerpt in your third witness statement, and looking at the third and fourth bullet points in particular, also referred, and this flows on from the answer you just given and earlier, the intention to establish a review team and for London, East Region and Scotland to act as the core team. And you go on to explain at the top of page 10 of your statement, just over the page, that the review team was never established and that the East Region and Scotland did not form part of the core team with London. Now, you've covered this previously, but is that summary still correct?
Yes.
Thank you. Now, was London seen as the region that was best placed to lead on the review of GRA 3.2 because of the sheer number of high-rise buildings in its area?
I believe so, and also clearly, not exclusively, but an awful lot of the learning that was going to need to be brought into the document would be associated with Lacknell. And so I think it was felt, and in my opinion quite rightly, that London was best placed to lead on that work.
Can you help the panel as to who made that decision, or was it taken before you were fully engaged in the project?
I can't say for sure who made it. I was privy to some of the discussions. You're aware from my statement that the Fire Brigade Union were not very happy with the idea of London leading. They felt there was a conflict of interest. So I was aware of some of the discussions, but in terms of who made the final decision, I would assume that was Derek Clough, possibly involving Chris Bolton and or Seafrau.
Thank you. Can we now turn to look at a number of documents that were produced by the LFB relating to the then current GRA 3.2 during this initial period and immediately after the Lacknell House fire in July 2009. And the first one of those documents I'd like to go to is Gary Dobson's review of operational procedures following that fire. Now, first of all, can we turn to a document which can be found at LFB 000-36602, which is a 3-page and heavily revised document sent by Gary Dobson to Tim Cutbill and Mick Titchener on the 27th of July 2009. Now, first of all, we know that Tim Cutbill had been appointed as the head of the LFB's Lacknell investigation project. Were you aware of that role at the time?
Sorry, could you repeat that question?
Of course. Now, we know that Tim Cutbill was appointed as the head of the LFB's internal Lacknell investigation team. Were you aware of the fact that Tim Cutbill had that role when you joined the GRA 3.2 working group, if I can call it that?
Yes.
And was his involvement in the LFB's own investigation considered to be an asset for these purposes to inform your work on GRA 3.2?
Absolutely. The review team had a lot of valuable information that was going to need to find its way into the GRA.
Mick Titchener, what was his role?
He was a station manager in the operational policy department. Again, just for clarity, I think this document slightly predates my time in the department.
That's why we will go through it simply because there's some points which may well set the context of the LFB's deliberations on this score. Now, Mick Titchener, I think, had at least attended a number of the GRA review committee meetings. Is that right? That's
correct. He attended with me, when Phil Moulton wasn't available.
Now, following on from the answers you've just given, have you seen this, or did you see this document at the time, i.e. when you started work on GRA 3.2?
I don't recall seeing it, and looking at I think it's dated 2009.
Yes.
It may well just predate either my time in the department or my time on that work stream. Now,
the document has track changes that are attributed to Dobson G. We're assuming that's Gary Dobson. Is there any reason to think that assumption isn't sound?
No, that's correct. I would think that's correct.
Now, mindful of the evidence you've given, I just want to go see how far we can go through some of the points arising in this document, just to see to what extent it reflected your understanding of when you started work on 3.2. Now, it's entitled Lacknell House Review of Operational Procedures, and the first subheading on page 1 is guidance that is not included in either the Generic Risk Assessment 3.2 High-Rise Firefighting version 2, GRA, or the London Fire Brigade Standard Operating Procedure Policy number 633 High-Rise Firefighting, open brackets, SOP, close brackets. Now, you've referred to this in earlier evidence, but GRA 3.2 version 2, that was the version published in 2008, is that right?
That's correct.
And that was the version that was current at the time of the Lacknell House fire?
Yes.
Now, we've got a list of bullet points underneath that first subheading, Mr. Cowup. And the first bullet point states this: no guidance on the possibility of downward vertical spread of fire from upper floors. Is that right?
Well, that's very true, and that was something that was not covered in version 2 of the GRA.
Thank you. And the second bullet point states limited information on the possibility of rapid fire spread and subsequent failure of compartmentation on the fire floors. Is that right? I believe there was reference to fire spread in the version 2 of the GRA. It probably didn't give the emphasis to it that Lacknell showed needed to be applied. And if we look, there's a reference to evacuation in the final bullet point within this first subsection, which says this: guidance is not provided on how to control large numbers of residents that could evacuate from a residential high-rise and hamper access of firefighting crews. Is that right?
It's correct to say there was no particular reference to evacuation in version 2 of the GRA.
Do you think the point set out here underneath the first subject heading constitute a considered reflection of the operational issues that the LFB thought were insufficiently addressed in the contemporaneous national guidance?
That appears to be the case. As I say, I've not seen this document before, and I'm not especially familiar with it, but I would say that's a fair way to characterise it, yes.
Now, would you probably be useful to look at what the LFB had identified as being the principal characteristics of the Lacknell fire in its immediate aftermath? The first principal characteristic would appear to be, and please say if you disagree or it's unfair in any way, the basic fact that compartmentation had not subsisted at the incident, and the LFB knew at the time that the fire had spread unexpectedly and rapidly from the fire flat on the 9th floor to other flats on and above the fire floor. Is that a fair summary?
It is. I mean, it also spread laterally within the building, I believe, and it also spread downwards as a result of falling debris. And those issues were not especially well covered in the GRA.
And looking at the second principal characteristic that would have been known, or that was known to the LFB in the immediate aftermath of the Lacknell fire, the external spread had been facilitated, at least in part, by the presence of non-compliant facade panels on the external wall of the building. Again, is that a fair summary?
I believe it is. Now, I don't know whether when this was written we would have known they were non-compliant, but certainly we knew that the panels that were involved, which were constructed from UPVC and insulation material, were not particularly resistant to fire, and in fact had burnt through quite quickly.
And it's more than that, though, isn't it? It's the fact that they were non-compliant. And on that point, if we can go to a letter that the then Commissioner sent to Sir Ken Knight, we know that the LFB identified the non-compliance as an issue, and it was the subject of a letter from Commissioner Dobson to Sir Ken Knight on the 14th of December 2009, and we can go to it, HOM 0000628. I think this has been flagged up with previous witnesses. And basically, Commissioner Dobson alerted Sir Ken to the LFB's investigations and suggesting that warnings should be issued to housing providers to carry out checks of their own external panels, because the LFB understood that this type of panel had been supplied by more than one company. Now, were you aware, first of all, of the fact that this letter had been sent and the substance?
I was not aware of this letter until in preparing for this inquiry. I saw you show it to other witnesses, and that's the first time that I'd seen it.
Were you aware, though, of the extent of the LFB's knowledge and concern about this type of panel that had been put on high-rise buildings?
In a general sense, I was aware that LFB had serious concerns about the way in which Lacknell House had been maintained and refurbished. In a general sense, I didn't have specific knowledge of this issue.
Okay. Now, looking at those two principal characteristics of the Lacknell fire, the fact that compartmentation had not subsisted and that the external spread had been facilitated by non-compliant panels, can you help us as to what extent, when your work started on the review of GRA 3.2, those two principal characteristics informed your deliberations?
They were very significant. They were clearly two of the key lessons identified from the Lacknell House fire. So yeah, they were clearly in our minds, and I think, as I've explained in my witness statement, we'd done a lot of work in the immediate before we started on the GRA. We'd done a lot of work on PN 633. And so unusually, for the way in which these things normally work, LFB's policy was ahead of national guidance at that point, because it incorporated the lessons identified from Lacknell. I believe we published the revised policy in November 2011, and that was around about the time that we started work on GRA 3.2. Probably we'd started several months before. So there was a large amount of input from LFB's policy into the national guidance, which, as I say, is unusual because normally national guidance shapes policy.
Thank you. So it's a little earlier than usual. The next topic will take some time, and it's probably unfair on Mr. Cowup to start it and then abruptly stop.
Well, I'm quite prepared to take your advice on that, but you reckon it'll take more than 10 or 15 minutes, do you?
Yes.
Very well. Perhaps we should take the chance while we have it, Mr. Cowup. As you probably know, we have a break during the morning. Normally it comes a little later than this, but there you are. It sounds as though it's a good time to do it. So we'll break now. We'll come back, please, at 11:25 and pick up again then. And I have to ask you, please, as I have all the other witnesses, not to talk about your evidence or anything relating to it while you're out of the room.
Indeed, sir.
All right? Thank you very much. Would you like to go with the usher, please?
Thank you.
Right, 11:25, please.
Thanks, sir.
Would you ask Mr. Cowup to come back in, please? Right, Mr. Cowup.
Indeed, thank
On we
you.
go then, thank you. Yes, Mr. Kinnear.
Thanks, sir. Mr. Cowup, I now want to turn to the second internal LFB document that I said I'd take you to, and that is Mr. Kevin Hughes' gap analysis, where he compared GRA 3.2, the 2008 version, with policy 633, the 2008 version of that as well. Now, can we go to LFB 000 57988? Now, presuming you've seen this before, this is an exhibit to your third witness statement, and it's a gap analysis that was carried out by DAC Kevin Hughes, as we can see there, in November 2009, and he carried out a comparison exercise between, as we discussed, GRA 3.2 and PN 633, both in their 2008 iterations. Now, you were familiar with this document at the time because you considered it when you prepared a report for the Corporate Management Board a year later in November 2010. Is that right?
That's correct.
And we're going to come on to that report shortly, but staying with the gap analysis for the moment. First of all, who instructed DAC Hughes to carry out the analysis?
I'm not sure. I would think it would have either been Gary Dobson as the Director for Resilience at the time, or possibly Assistant Commissioner Jim Knighton.
But it wasn't you.
It wasn't me. I was a co-worker of Kevin's at the time.
Now, we can see from the front page that Kevin Hughes was a DAC when the document was drafted. Can you remember now what his specific responsibility was at the time of drafting, so November 2009?
Yes, I believe that at the time he was head of the planning group within operations, and also I think he headed up the operational review team, which was a group of officers that I think you've heard about them before, that attended incidents to provide support and to monitor performance.
And I think I'm right in saying later on, certainly from 2013 onwards, he was head of learning. Is that right? Or if you can't
Sounds a rather grand title, doesn't it? He was. I think he was part of the team that managed the Babcock training contract, and I think in particular played a part in developing and implementing the training commissioning process, TCAP, that you've heard a lot about.
We have. Would it be, or can you help us as to what the purpose of this gap analysis was? Was it to provide a basis for the review of 3.2 and PN 633, and or some other purpose?
I think it had a primarily, well, not primarily, I'd imagine solely internal purpose. I think it was felt necessary to make sure that our local policy 633 was wholly compatible with the national guidance, which was 2008, and I've lost track. I can't remember the iterations of 633 as to whether or not it had been reviewed post 2008.
Thank you. Now, the gap analysis, as is in the nature of these things, identified a number of gaps. And if we can turn to consider and discuss some of those.
Of course.
The first one I'd be grateful for you to look at is at page 9, and it's the very bottom row, which is under the heading Key Control Measures. Now, as you can see, this addresses pre-planning and information gathering, and we can see in the far left-hand side column at the very bottom of this page that the material parts of GRA 3.2 version 2 are quoted. And these include, and apologies, we have to jump over to the next page for some of this. We can see in the second paragraph of that far left column, it says this, that the direction, we find the direction that, and I quote, pre-planning arrangement should also include, and turning to the second bullet point, the development of contingency plans for a range of reasonably foreseeable events, such as fire spread beyond the compartment of origin and the potential for multiple rescues. And if we can move rightwards, but staying at the top of page 10, we see in the next column the relevant text from the then version of Policy 633. Looking at that, though this does not refer to the need for contingency plans or fire spread beyond the compartment of origin, is that a fair observation?
Yes.
If we look at the third column from the left, the analysis, the gap analysis is set out, and this states, and apologies for this purpose, if we just go back to the bottom of page 9, and this states this, the GRA's guidance in this section is slightly more detailed than LFB Policy 633. LFB policy is also less explicit on the development of contingency plans. And in the next final column, we see under the heading Recommendations this. LFB policy could be enhanced with the inclusion of further information on, going to page 10, second bullet point, development of operational contingency plans. Is that right?
That's correct, and that's what it says, yeah.
Thank you. Now, what did you understand the phrase contingency plans to mean in this context?
My understanding of the phrase contingency plan in this context is the kind of plan that you would develop for a high-risk premises. So clearly, we can't have individual contingency plans for every building in London. That the task would be impracticable. So my understanding of operational contingency plans, and they were referred to in various guises during my service. So sometimes they were called Operational Note 300, sometimes they were called A010, was where individual buildings that were considered to be of particular risk or particular value, so I'm thinking about national heritage sites, would have a detailed contingency plan for that premises. So the operational policy gives you the guidance for an incident type, and these plans would tell you specific features of those buildings.
And are those the same type of contingency plans that you'd expect a crew to carry out on a 72D visit, for example?
They may inform the contingency plan, but the 72D visit is an information gathering activity under which if the premises or location is considered of sufficient risk, there may be a need to devise a tactical plan. But I think in this context, Kevin was referring to the higher level contingency plans which were produced at headquarters on a brigade-wide basis.
So not necessarily those contingency plans that you'd expect to see recorded on the ORD, for example?
Correct.
Thank you. Now, given the higher level nature of the contingency plans that are discussed here, can you recall whether any of these high level ones concerned high-rise residential buildings?
We certainly had them for what I would describe as landmark high-rise buildings in London, Tower 42, the Shard, the Walkie-Talkie, buildings of that nature, which were often of mixed use, so there has a residential component. Specifically, residential buildings, I can't think of any off the top of my head.
Thank you. Now, the need for contingency plans did not feature on Gary Dobson's review that we looked at just before the break, which he carried out in July 2009. But would it be correct to say that by the time this gap analysis was compiled, so broadly 6 months later, the LFB was aware that its own local policy, 633, did not refer to the need for contingency plans in the event of fire spread beyond the compartment of origin, despite that being referred to in GRA 3.2?
That would appear to be the case, yes.
Were you concerned by that absence in the LFB's own policy of any reference to the need for contingency plans in the event of fire spread beyond the compartment of origin?
Well, I think in terms of the changes that we made to 633 that were published in November 2011, we did address that issue, I believe. That's my recollection.
We'll come on to those in due course. It's probably easier when we come on to
Okay.
that topic, because I don't want to ask you questions in a vacuum. But I can assure you we'll come back to that
Sure.
issue in due course. Now, the second point in the gap analysis that I'd like to discuss with you concerns rapid fire spread and failure of compartmentation. And for this purpose, can we look at page 3 of this document and the top row, which addresses vertical fire spread. Now, that was a reference to rapid vertical external fire spread in both GRA 3.2 and 633. And in the first column on the left-hand side, the far left-hand side, again, it sets out the relevant extracts from the then GRA. And it says this: vertical fire spread can be extensive and rapid. Such spread may travel internally, but more commonly occurs externally when fire breaks out of windows and hugs the building, where it can quickly travel to stories above. This is known as the Coanda effect. And if we move rightwards and look in the second column, it rehearses what was set out in Policy 633, and we can see the text is almost identical to that of 3.2. Now, would that near identical nature of the text be because whoever drafted 633 had been guided by the provisions of GRA 3.2
I would strongly suspect so, yes.
and simply lifted the text, but basically?
Absolutely.
Looking forward, we look in the recommendation section. It says this in the second paragraph down from the top. Both documents, so 3.2 and 633, provide limited information on rapid fire spread and subsequent failure of compartmentation on the fire floor. Now, would you agree that that observation mirrored one of the points that Gary Dobson had identified in July 2009?
Indeed.
Thank you. And we can see from the text in both the first and second columns on that page that there was in fact reference to rapid external fire spread in both of them. Is that right?
I believe so, yes.
Would it also be correct to say that the issue that Kevin Hughes had identified was the absence of guidance on the combination of rapid external fire spread, which leads to the subsequent internal breach of compartmentation?
Could you?
Of course, yes. Would you agree with me that the issue that Mr. Hughes has identified here in his gap analysis was the absence of guidance on the combination of rapid external fire spread, which then led to the subsequent internal breach of compartmentation?
I mean, he clearly brought the two together. I don't think that necessarily means that the two are always present. So it's possible to have rapid external spread without necessarily having a failure of compartmentation within the building. So if that helps.
Thank you. But nonetheless, Mr. Hughes has identified both.
He has, and he's brought them together in one sentence. I'm just trying to point out that the two may not necessarily always accompany each other.
Thank you. Now, looking at the guidance itself, would you expect guidance, whether it's 3.2 or 633, to give advice as to what operationally needs to be done or should be done when faced with rapid external fire spread in conjunction with compartmentation failure? Would you expect that to be found in the GRA, in the local policy, or both?
Both.
And can you help us why should it be in both?
Well, because clearly the whole point of both documents is to shape firefighters' behaviour and to provide them with information and guidance on the actions that need to be taken. So in the case of external fire spread, it's about being aware of it, seeing it and responding to it. And in terms of internal failure, that's very much about fire spread, but it's also about firefighter safety and being aware of where the fire may be reaching, even though it may not be visible.
Thank you. Now, the third point in Mr. Hughes' gap analysis that I'd like to turn to is evacuation. And can we turn to page 8? Excuse me. And we can see there in the first substantive row addresses evacuation specifically in the context of how this may affect firefighting operations. And we can see in the first column on the left, it records again the text of the then contemporaneous 3.2. And the gap analysis refers to evacuation in the particular context of congestion of access and egress routes, because that can occur when residents are evacuating and firefighters are entering the building to conduct operations. And there's also a reference there, I think I'm right in saying, to evacuation in the context of operational pre-planning and whether the building is designed for phased evacuation, stay put, or simultaneous evacuation. Is that a fair reading?
Yes,
Have I brought out the points that are relevant there in relation to evacuation?
I believe so, yes.
And we can see, just moving rightwards in the second column, again it sets out the position under 633, and it says this, and I quote, "Firefighting operations can be affected by the type of evacuation being undertaken, the progress of the evacuation, and the number and type of people being evacuated. Consider both the effect of firefighting tactics on evacuation of occupants and, conversely, the effect of evacuation on tactics." Now, taking the step back, neither extract seems to address when an emergency evacuation may need to be implemented in a residential high-rise building that normally has a stay-put policy in place. Is that a fair reading of what is set out there in the table?
I would say it is, yes.
Thank you. Now, again, looking at the recommendation column in the far right-hand side of the table, it says this: LFB policy could be enhanced with the inclusion of further information on building evacuation strategies. Can you help us? What was your understanding of what that recommendation intended?
My understanding of that was that the evacuation strategy is clearly devised by the responsible person, i.e. the building owner or whoever's responsible for the building in fire safety terms. And I think what that is alluding to is the fact that when and if a fire escalates, it's clearly important that the firefighters responding to that incident, and in particular the incident commander, is A, aware of the strategy, and B, aware of the need to change it if the fire situation dictates that's appropriate. So I think that is what Kevin was referring to, and that is some learning that we did indeed take forward into 633 and GRA 3.2.
Mr. Cowup, we've got the benefit of your 3 decades plus experience. Looking at what's set out on this page, bearing in mind your expertise and experience, what type of further information on evacuation strategies do you think should have been provided in either 3.2 or 633?
Looking at that now, with the benefit of what I know now, I think it's fair to say evacuation was a blind spot, both for London Fire Brigade, but probably more importantly at the time for the entire UK Fire Service. So there was no national guidance on evacuation, and indeed I don't believe there still is. London Fire Brigade has recently written a policy on that. But I think it's fair to say, as a service, we were not as aware of that issue as we should have been. I think we made steps in the right direction because we included a section on evacuation and fire survival guidance in both 3.2 and 633. But when I reflect on it now, we didn't cover that subject in as much detail as we should have done.
Looking back now, what detail do you think should have been provided that you feel was missing?
From my own opinion, is that what we should really have been telling people is the triggers, the signs and symptoms.
What to look out for.
What to look out for to move from whatever the evacuation strategy might be. And I think it's important to point out that both GRA 3.2 and PN 633 cover all high-rise buildings. So there are a number of evacuation strategies that firefighters might encounter. So I know the inquiry has understandably got focused on stay put, but of course there's zonal evacuation, there's phased evacuation, and they're all different. So we need to know what the evacuation strategy is, but we need to recognise when events are overtaking it. So the signs and symptoms, which I believe LFB have now addressed, is what was missing for sure.
What to look out for,
Yes,
what your options are,
yes.
and what options are appropriate to the circumstances that are confronting the incident commander. Is that a threefold fair summary?
I think it is a fair summary. And just to add to the comment you made about options, I think it's fair to say when the evacuation strategy is required to be changed, there's really only two options, which is some form of partial evacuation, which would probably be the fire floor and the floor above in normal circumstances, progressing beyond that if the fire situation dictated, or if the situation was so serious, to carry out a full evacuation. So I don't think there are an endless range of permutations. I think there are two basic considerations for an incident commander, which would be to either partially evacuate the affected floor and possibly an adjacent floor, or to fully evacuate.
Going back to an answer you gave earlier on, you used the phrase a blind spot in the sector generally about evacuation. Why do you think that blind spot existed?
Why do I think that blind spot existed? I think it's because evacuation is something we carried out, and I've been involved in it myself, and in many respects it's fairly intuitive, and people of course often act of their own volition, so our role is really to facilitate what is happening on the ground. Often when we arrive in office buildings in particular, they've got decreed evacuation procedures, and often when you attend a fire in an office building, an evacuation is in progress. So our role was to allow that to progress, to assist if anyone needed assistance, but often that's not the case. But to answer your question, I just don't think we understood before the Grenfell Tower tragedy. I don't think we understood our possible role in evacuation and the need to provide firefighters with specific guidance to deal with it.
And in particular incident commanders, presumably there.
And in particular incident commanders.
Does it follow that, looking at this early stage in the review process, was the group proceeding on the basis that evacuation would only ever need to be carried out in a building with a pre-existing explicit evacuation plan?
It was my understanding that any high-rise, we're talking specifically about high-rise.
We are, yes, sorry,
Yeah.
I should have made that clear.
It's my understanding that any high-rise building would be covered by the legislation, and therefore there would be a requirement upon the responsible person to devise an evacuation strategy that would be appropriate to the building and to the risk. So I would expect an evacuation strategy to exist for every high-rise building, yes.
Even one with a stay-put policy in place?
Well, if I accept stay put is not truly an evacuation strategy, it's more of a design principle, but it's a strategy in the sense that you're saying for that building that people will be safe in their flats, in their homes, unless they are directly affected by fire or smoke. So generally you're saying in those buildings that only the people who are directly involved in the fire will need to leave their premises.
Thank you. Can I turn on to another aspect of the gap analysis, Mr. Cowup, and that's can be found at page 18, and it's the bottom half of that page. And we see here there's a subheading, additional issues not covered by either LFB policy 633 or the GRA. And paragraph number 2 says this, and I quote, "Neither the GRA nor LFB policy 633 gives guidance on the specific challenges of crews tasked to deploy to the bridgehead becoming involved in assisting residents evacuating." LFB policy could be enhanced with the inclusion of further information on the challenges of the competing demands of assisting residents evacuate from a place of relative safety and deploying to attack the fire. Additionally, how to control large numbers of residents that could evacuate from a residential high-rise. Now, taking the step back, is it fair to say that what this extract is getting at, and in particular the need to be able to assist residents who are evacuating and the control of a large number of residents evacuating, is how to manage an emergency evacuation at a high-rise building, and the emphasis being on the word emergency?
Yes. Yes, I think that's a fair characterisation. I think what certainly what Kevin was getting to in the second sentence there is to be aware that these things can be very resource intensive. So when you're...
Emergency evacuations you're talking about?
Yes. I mean, one of the key lessons from Lacanau was that crews that were deployed for one task were diverted to assist people before they reached the location for that task. So for incident commanders to be aware of the need to have sufficient resources available and possibly to request additional resources if necessary. In terms of controlling large numbers of residents, again, yeah, I think that's a valid point. I think both the GRA and 633 refer to the fact that you may have to mount your response alongside people leaving the building. So you need to give consideration to how to do that. One of the ways of achieving that is to designate an attack staircase and an evacuation staircase if the building provides two staircases. So that's an example of how you might control the evacuation of a large number of people.
But obviously difficulties are presented with buildings such as Grenfell that had the one staircase, of course.
Absolutely.
Now, did Mr. Hughes's gap analysis is a very rich, detailed document. Did you discuss it with him, its substance, at the time?
I didn't discuss it at the time it was written. In fact, I don't think I was immediately aware he'd done it. You asked who he did it for. I think it was whoever he did it for would have seen it first. I think it went into the Lacanau board process that was running at the time. So I'm not sure that I saw it. I think it was written in 2009, wasn't it?
It was, and I think in your evidence you say you certainly were aware of it no later than November 2010.
Yes.
And so did the points that Mr. Hughes set out here, did it certainly inform your consideration of the requirements for revision of both 3.2 and 633?
Absolutely. I mean, we did go through this document and seek to address both the gaps and the recommendations.
Did you use it in a manner of a benchmark, so you went back to it to check that you'd covered off everything in the new drafting that Mr. Hughes had identified as missing?
We certainly made extensive reference to it. I can't remember whether we specifically audit what we wrote against this. I can't say that with 100% certainty, but we certainly had regard to it.
It was in your mind?
Absolutely.
Can I turn now to the LFB's memorandum to the Chief Fire and Rescue Advisor? And just to give you some context, following Mr. Hughes's gap analysis, Tim Cutbill prepared a 2-page memorandum to Chris Bolton, who I think you referred to in evidence earlier on, and it's dated the 21st of January 2020. And if we go to that, 2010.
Okay.
If we could go to LFB 000 41978. Now, as you can see, the memorandum is entitled The Brief for FRAU, and I think that stands for the Fire and Rescue Advisors Unit, is that right?
Yes, I believe so.
With considerations for a review of the generic risk assessment for high-rise firefighting following the fire at Lacanau House, and the first sentence of the first substantive paragraph explains that this brief is given to assist CLG with a review of generic risk assessment GRA 3.2 high-rise firefighting. Now, I think I'm right in saying, but please shout if this is wrong, that Chris Bolton was the senior fire and rescue advisor at the time.
That's correct.
And again, just to make this clear from your previous evidence, he would have reported directly to Sir Ken, or whoever was the chief fire and rescue advisor.
I believe so.
And at the time, January 2010, it was Sir Ken Knight.
Yes.
Have you seen this before?
I have not.
Mindful of that answer, can I just go through some of the points just to bring it to your attention? Can we look at point 1, which is the bottom half of the first page of the memo, and it says this: fire spread. The potential for wind-driven products of combustion and burning materials being forced back into other areas of the building, creating multi-seated fires on various floors. Look at point 2, fire spread. The risks associated with early failure of compartmentation to contain the spread of fire, and particularly the products of combustion, e.g. due to age, poor design, workmanship, maintenance or alterations leading to the spread of fire and smoke logging extensively through the building. And point 5, fire service tactics. The difficulties that may be experienced conducting search, rescue and evacuation of a large number of properties or areas within a high-rise building, and the complexity of recording and monitoring the progress of this activity. Now, looking at what's set out there, Mr. Cowup, these points confirm that the LFB was concerned that the review of GRA 3.2 should address the need for guidance in relation to smoke and fire spread beyond the compartment of origin, fires on multiple floors, and difficulties posed by evacuation in such circumstances. Is that a fair reading of that memo?
Yes.
Would you agree with me that there is no reference there to stay put?
In this document?
Yes.
No, I can't see any. I've not seen it before, but what I've read, there's no mention of stay put.
And there's equally no reference to the possibility of evacuating a building with a stay put policy. Is that right?
It's not, I mean, you could argue it's implicit in 5, but it's not stated explicitly, no.
Is the fact that it's not clearly set out, using a neutral phrase, indicate that it was simply not a possibility that the LFB was envisaging at the time, i.e. evacuating a building with a stay put policy?
I don't think that's a fair characterisation.
In what ways is it unfair?
Well, because when you look at the changes we made to both GRA 3.2 and PN 633, both of those documents are very clear about the need for the incident commander to consider revoking stay put or the evacuation strategy, whatever that might be, whether that's phased or whatever, and carrying out a fuller evacuation. So I think in terms of our responses, we did address it. This particular memorandum, I accept, doesn't cover it, but I'm not sure of the status of this or what it was used to. It certainly wasn't given to me by DCLG.
That was something I was about to say. It's not something that Tim Cutbill said, listen, you need to see this, Peter.
He didn't share it with me, no.
Thank you. Now, can we turn to your own report to the Corporate Management Board in November 2010? So some 10 months after the Cutbill memorandum. Now, you prepared a report for is it the Corporate Management Board, the CMB?
That's correct.
In November 2010, regarding the LFB's review of Policy 633, which was continuing at that time. And we can find the report at LFB 00101356. And if we can have a look at the first few paragraphs on that page, page 1, under the heading Introduction. And you wrote the following. The purpose of this report is to explain the rationale for the changes that have been made to Policy 633, which has recently been updated and is presented as draft for Corporate Management Board approval. This report also explains how the amendments to the policy have been underpinned by the outcomes from a risk assessment panel and how the new policy will be introduced to the operational workforce, utilising appropriate training interventions and internal communications. Next is a heading Policy Review Process. And apologies for reading it out, but it's probably easier for people at home. A key driver underpinning the review of this policy was the Lacknell House fire, which occurred on 3rd of July 2009. DAC Hughes undertook a gap analysis following this incident and made recommendations regarding any areas that are covered in the National Generic Risk Assessment, GRA, but are either only partially covered or omitted from LFB Policy 633. All DAC Hughes' recommendations, as set out in his report dated November 2009, have been acted upon within the revised Policy 633, with the exception of provision of new equipment system to record search information. This is subject to an R&D project to help define user requirements for this equipment. Controlling smoke travel. This issue requires further travel by FSR. Can you help us, remind us what FSR stands for?
Fire safety regulation.
And will be covered to some extent by revised policy regarding fixed installations. The fixed installation policy will be applicable to all building types, not just high-rise, and will be a cross-reference to high-rise note when published. It is anticipated that the possible provision of positive pressure ventilation, PPV, will form part of the project to replace pumping appliances. Revised BA policies, that's breathing apparatus, including multi-agency BA commitment, e.g. HART, and if you remind us again, that HART stands for?
Hazardous Area Response Team. It's an ambulance team that can commit into irrespirable atmospheres with breathing apparatus.
Thank you. And will follow from revised national BA guidance, which currently remains in draft. Provision of premises information boxes at high-rise premises is an FSR issue. OP, operational procedures,
Correct.
are working on a draft search policy, which, when published, will be cross-referenced from the high-rise policy. Now, we'll come on to the substantive review of 633 in due course, as we've discussed. But for the moment, looking at these elements of your report, was it your review that the aspects of the Hughes gap analysis had each been addressed in the revision of 633, subject to the exceptions set out there?
I believe so, yes.
Now, am I right that the revisions to 633 to which you were referring to there were revisions that appeared in 633, which was published in November 2011?
I believe so.
Now, could we turn to look at that policy, because it's something you referred to several times in your evidence, and you've exhibited it helpfully to your witness statement, and it can be found at LFB 00102306. Now, I'm assuming that you are familiar with the terms of this policy.
I'm indeed, yes.
Now, would you agree that despite the identification of a lack of guidance on contingency plans for fire spread beyond the compartment of origin in the Hughes analysis, this policy does not refer to contingency plans at all?
It refers to pre-planning, and the policy for pre-planning was obviously a separate document. So, and I think it refers to that separate document. It's what became PN 800. I'm not sure if it was called PN 800 at this time.
And so when you say pre-planning, do you have in mind that reference to contingency plans ought to be found in Appendix 1?
Yes.
So can we turn to that at page 15? I don't wish to proceed on a false assumption, Mr. Cowup, and if I am getting this wrong, please do shout. But could you help the panel where in Appendix 1 of 633 there's a reference to, express reference to contingency plans? If you need time to refresh your memory, please say so.
The third bullet point in 1, I accept it doesn't use the word contingency planning, but the description there accords with what I understand to be contingency planning.
But the words aren't used, are they?
I accept the word contingency is not used, but detailed planning for specific buildings, including tactical and command plans, that is a way of describing a contingency plan.
Could we look at paragraph 4?
Of course.
And the 10th bullet point, apologies, you have to count down. It's the 10th bullet point, which starts with the words, the likelihood and impact of any fire spread beyond the compartment of origin and the potential for multiple rescues.
Yes.
That seems to be closest to the point that a contingency plan is meant to address, but there's no reference to contingency plan there either, is there? Is that a fair criticism?
It's a fair criticism looking back on it now, yes.
Taking the step back, Mr. Cowup, there doesn't appear to be guidance, at least in this document, and again, if you want to refresh your memory, that's not a problem, please say so. There's no reference to any guidance to crews about what should be done if the building does in fact appear to present a risk of fire spread beyond the compartment of origin and the potential for multiple rescues. Again, is that a fair point to make in relation to Appendix 1 of 633?
Can I ask, is that question in the context of planning or in the context of response during an incident, or both?
First of all, planning.
Okay, so I think it's fair to say that the detailed guidance for planning was set out in a separate policy document, which I think is PN 800, and I think that does cover fire spread.
There's no, and please, again, if I've got this wrong, just say so. Is there a cross-reference to 800 in this Appendix 1?
Not in this Appendix 1, but I believe the policy as a whole cross-references PN 800, and I think in the main text it refers to it. In the planning section of the main document.
Would you like to, if we go back to the first page of this policy?
Yes.
And then you can direct the document manager to the point you'd like to make.
So if we look at page 7, okay, so I apologise. There was a renumbering process going on. So I think where it refers there to policy note 521, information gathering, that's what became PN 800. So it is referring staff to that specific guidance.
Thank you. Now, in relation to the point identified by Kevin Hughes about the existing guidance on rapid external fire spread and compartmentation failure being limited, as far as I can see, there are two additional references to rapid fire spread in the policy. The first one we can find is in the pre-planning section on page 15, so if we go to that. And it's the 12th bullet point, which starts with the phrase floor layouts. And the second reference, can we go back to page 2? And it's the 8th bullet point under the heading hazards, where there's reference to rapid and unpredictable fire spread up and down and laterally in a building. To the best of your recollection, are those the two references to rapid fire spread in 633, or this iteration of it?
No, because I think if you look in the hazards section, you'll find that information probably expanded slightly. So the bullet point that starts rapid and unpredictable fire spread is an outtake. The key point summary is an outtake from the main policy. So I think if we look at the hazard section...
Of course, let's go to it.
We should find it there.
If we can go to the first page, you see hazards at page 4. Section 2. What are the points you'd like to highlight to the panel there?
We'll need to go through this whole section, Mr. Kinnear, if you don't mind, because I'm not as familiar with this version as I am with the version that was current at the time of the Grenfell fire. So this is an older version, but somewhere here it should say, because it wouldn't be in the key point summary, if we hadn't have included it in the hazard section. So it may be under fire behaviour and development.
If we can go to page 5 and para 2.15, is that what you had in mind?
Yes.
Now, looking at that section under fire behaviour and development, and bearing in mind your knowledge of the development of this particular policy, is it right to say that despite the 2 references to rapid fire spread and looking at what's set out here in paras 2.15 onwards, there's no guidance as to what operational steps should be taken when firefighters and incident commander is facing a fire that is rapidly spreading and breaching compartmentation?
I wouldn't expect guidance to be provided in this section, but I think if we move to the section that talks about procedure,
Yeah.
we will find in the round, we will find guidance for managing an escalating fire.
And if we can go to page 1 again, which sets out the index, is it operational procedure you have in mind?
That's correct.
And if we go to page 9, it's not going to be, if it can be de-amplified. The advice isn't going to be in the securing water section. It's not in securing using the firefighting lift, so we can turn over the page. It's not going to be in establishing a bridgehead, so we can turn over the page. Committing crews, it's not going to be in that section, so we can turn over the page. And then we come to evacuation, and it's not there as far as I can see. Ventilation, it's not there if we can turn over the page. And then we're into building design and fire safety measures, it's not there, is it?
It's the words are not there as they're used in the hazard section, but I think you can draw it clearly from, 744 refers to a building's design measures being compromised, a loss of compartmentation. If any of the fire safety measures in 746 have been compromised, you need to consider requesting additional resources and implement alternative tactics. I think it's there. I accept it's not there as explicitly as it could be, but I think it is there in the text implicitly.
There's not much detail there, though, is there?
No, I accept that.
And you said you accept it's not there as explicitly as it could be. How could you what further detail, if you think more detail is needed, what further detail would you have put in then, had you had if you were minded to do so?
Well, I think, as I said previously to one of your previous questions, an indication of the signs and symptoms of a spreading fire would be useful guidance to include, and then some reference to the alternative tactics that might then be necessary to be employed.
And it's the detail of those alternative tactics, really, that's important.
Yes.
Now, can we turn to a separate topic, which is the review of GRA 3.2 and its formal allocation to the LFB? Now, you say, we don't need to go to it unless you'd like to, you say at paragraph 2.3.4 of the PC6 report, which can be found at LFB 000-327-83/7, that GRA 3.2 was allocated to LFB by the programme manager in March 2011. Is that correct?
Yes.
Now, the documents we've just looked at appear to indicate that it was agreed much earlier than that, shortly after the Lacknell House fire in July 2009, that London was to take the lead on the review of GRA 3.2. Is that a fair observation?
It appears to be from the written records, but I think, as I said earlier, I don't remember being party to that discussion. And I certainly don't remember the consideration that it might be free services that lead on it.
Can you help us as to what was happening about the review of GRA 3.2 between July 2009, when priority was given to it, and the decision to allocate the review to London in March 2011?
No, I can't.
Does that mean that nothing was happening?
No, it doesn't. It just means I'm not cited on it. I mean, clearly from the documents that we've found, that was clearly a discussion that was happening at CLG. I wasn't party to that discussion, and in terms of the prioritisation of it, I wasn't aware of why it wasn't dealt with sooner.
Now, in fairness to you, we've obviously looked at certain documents. So we looked at the Hughes gap analysis, we've looked at the cut bill memorandum, we've looked at your own report of November 2010. So it's consideration of issues, but was any sort of basic drafting going on during that period?
Of GRA 3.2?
Yeah.
Not by me, because I don't think we'd been formally allocated it.
And so far as you're aware, no one else?
I can't, as far as I'm aware, yes.
Were you ever presented with a working draft?
No.
So it's safe to infer that no one else was doing any drafting then, presumably?
I don't believe so.
Was the delay a source of concern either at the LFB or with any other interested party?
I'm not really able to answer that. I'm certainly not aware, I wasn't made aware of any concerns about the GRA being delayed.
So the Commissioner wasn't saying anything to you?
He wasn't saying anything to me. That's not to say he wasn't concerned or that he didn't say it to someone else.
I can only fairly ask you about what...
Yeah, he certainly didn't say anything to me, no.
You were certainly given no instruction to crack on because nothing's happening?
No.
Put crudely?
No. Crudely or otherwise, no.
Thank you. Now, in your third statement, at paragraph 36, you refer to a document entitled the Generic Risk Assessment Review Programme Schedule of Work 2011-2012, which you state shows that London had been given responsibility for GRA 3.2 with a start date of October 2011 for that work. And if we go to the schedule, and I'm afraid the trial director will have to download the native file. It can be found at LFB 00102323. Now, we can see that GRA 3.2 is listed on line 19, and the start date for work is identified in column E as October 2011. We see at column F, the end date is February 2012. Have I read it right?
You have.
And does that time period, i.e. between October 2011 and February 2012, reflect the 100-day period that was set out in Lee Brinton's flowchart of milestones?
I'm sure it does. I haven't done the calculation, but I suspect it would have reflected that, yes.
When you prepared this schedule, so at the start of matters, did you have any reservations about the realism of the 100-day target?
Firstly, I didn't prepare this schedule. This was prepared by Derek Clough or possibly Lee Brinton. Yes, I expressed my concerns on a number of occasions that I thought the timescales were, to say the least, optimistic. They were revised as a result. I'm not quite sure when, but they were extended. And particularly for high-rise, I anticipated that there was going to be a lot of feedback and that timescale was very optimistic.
Now, in terms of London's role as lead, you explained in your third statement, paragraph 31, which can be found at LFB 00119849/18. Probably worth going to just so you see what I'm referring to. You say there, this role, about London's lead role, included gathering information regarding new hazards and any tactical learning that had been identified from recent UK high-rise fires. This was used to determine any new control measures deemed necessary to address the identified hazards and to produce a number of draft versions of the GRA for other members of the review committee and the organisations they represented to comment upon. First of all, is that an accurate summary?
Yes.
Now, That process would have included, presumably, any lessons that the LFB had identified arising from LACNOR.
Indeed.
And at this time, so 2011, the inquest had not yet taken place, but the LFB had carried out its own internal investigations. Is that right?
That's correct.
So that would have included the two principal characteristics that the LFB had identified arising from the LACNOR fire, which we discussed earlier.
Yes.
Would it also have been your role to manage the 2 rounds of consultation that Lee Brinton's milestone document identified?
Partly.
So who else would have been involved?
Very much Derek Clough. He was responsible, certainly at the national stage, he was responsible for issuing the document, and following discussion with myself, we agreed it was sensible to delay that pending the coroner's inquest from both LACNOR and Shirley Towers.
We'll come on to that in due course.
Sorry.
But don't worry. But were you primarily responsible for considering all the consultation responses received from the various CFIR regional reps?
In consultation with Phil Moulton and others in ops policy, I didn't work
So when
on
I
it.
mean you as the collective.
Yes, me as the collective, absolutely.
And equally, were you in that collective sense responsible for considering all the consultation responses received from the individual fire and rescue authorities?
Yes.
Did the burden of drafting the revised GRA 3.2 fall to you personally or you collectively?
Given its importance, there was a lot of it that was me personally, but Phil Moulton played his part, and indeed some other people from ops policy provided track change comments and suggested ideas. So it was a team effort, but I did play a very direct and personal role in it, yes.
To use the pompous lawyer's phrase, did you primarily hold the pen?
I suppose I did, yeah. I mean, rank has its privileges, but I think I was fairly democratic, so I don't think I held the pen maliciously.
And were you happy that you had the knowledge and expertise available to you to carry out the drafting process effectively?
Yes. Yeah, I mean, in terms of my own knowledge and experience, I felt I was well placed to do that work, but I was very much open to taking advice and views from others, and that was the point of the consultation process.
Thank you. Now, if we can go through each of the stages of the review process, and the first bit I'd like to discuss with you is internal consultation with the LFB itself.
Mm-hmm.
Now, if we can take, for that purpose, could I first take you to an email which attached a draft version of GRA 3.2 that you sent on 18th of October 2011 to your colleagues in the LFB. So it's Malcolm Ettridge, Spencer Alden-Smith and Andrew Porter, and certainly the first two you referred to in an earlier answer. Now, the email can be found at LFB 00102337. There we go. That's the email. And you explain in your third statement, and we don't need to go to it, but that these three individuals were, quotes, the three GM policy leads, so that's group manager, policy leads in my department at the time, and were familiar with the developments with PN 633. They also had a significant degree of both operational and policy risk assessment writing experience, and therefore I invited their feedback on the draft. Now, the draft that you attached, we don't necessarily have to go to it quite yet, but the references are LFB 00102338. But did the draft that you produced draw on the existing version of 3.2 and make amendments to reflect the issues that had been under discussion internally at the LFB arising from LACNOR?
That's my recollection, yes.
And the attachment to this email, was that the first working draft that you produced? It's certainly the first one we've been able to locate.
I couldn't swear to that with any certainty. As I think I said earlier, one of my aims in carrying out this work was to take the information from version 2, make sure we didn't lose any of that, add to it in terms of the learning from LACNOR and other incidents, and then present that back in a more logical framework, which was to provide it more chronologically in terms of the order in which the information would be needed at an incident. I thought that was easier to understand, but crucially, it would be easier for local policy writers to then convert that into a working local policy.
And flowing from that, could we look at the fourth paragraph of your covering email, where you set out this? The overriding aim of the revised draft is to provide a document which permits both FRS and individual ICs, so incident commanders, the freedom to exercise discretion from the standard operating procedure. Recognising this is a national document, I see this as an opportunity to create the space necessary for individual FRSs to write a less prescriptive policy if they choose to do so, and so that they can determine their own risk appetite within a robust but pragmatic national statement of hazards and risk for this incident type. My first question is, who sanctioned that particular approach?
I don't know that it was formally explicitly sanctioned. It was my view, and certainly the view that I was hearing in the committee, was that we should be writing national guidance in a way that allows local fire services to implement it in a way that works for their service in terms of their resourcing and their equipment, and also in terms of their local risk.
What did you precisely mean by the phrase permitting the freedom to exercise discretion from the standard operating procedure?
That was possibly an oblique reference to the concept of operational discretion, which is something we were working on alongside this policy work. And that was a recognition that you cannot write fire service procedure to anticipate every single scenario. And we need to empower staff to exercise their judgment. Now, up until the time that operational discretion was articulated, the only guidance we provided was a statement in the DRA policy that says you can exercise professional judgment. If I'm honest, I was never exactly sure what that meant. And I thought we needed to tell people that what we really meant was you need to do the right thing, and that may be outside of procedure. And if it is, provided you do a risk-benefit analysis, in other words, a dynamic risk assessment, and you feel that that action is justified, then it is reasonable for you to exercise that discretion. And I was very keen at this time to get that concept embedded nationally, because it was at this time only really had any currency within London, and even in London hadn't been adopted formally. But I knew, in terms of endorsement, I knew that Commissioner Ron Dobson, Gary Reason, and various other key officers were very supportive of that general approach.
What is striking is, when going through the documents we've been considering this morning, is that all those documents focus on what's missing from the GRA, or 633 as the case may be. None appears to set out the overriding aim as you set it out in this email. Is that a fair comment to make on what had preceded this?
Clearly it's accurate. Whether it's fair in the context of implicitly criticising those documents, I think, to be fair, those
It's just a sort of those more basic. There's no hidden point. It was just to say, what is striking about the documents we've looked at is they're concentrating on what's missing. What they're not setting out is that the overriding aim of 3.2 should be as you've set it out here. It's just a question of fact rather than anything else.
I think that's a fair characterisation, but I think, to be fair to the people who wrote the documents you're referring to, they were probably given quite a specific task and brief, and they would have addressed that. This concept of discretion and the whole idea of, are we going to allow people, are we going to explicitly sanction people to break with procedure, was new. And I have to say, it wasn't universally agreed to. So there were people in the GRA committee who were quite passionately against it. There were people in LFB. I had very interesting discussions with some of LFB lawyers about this concept, because they felt a policy to break policy wasn't necessarily a good idea. Personally, because of where it came from, which was our experience at 7/7, but also some other national incidents where fire services had slavishly followed policy, and as a result people had been injured and indeed lost their lives. So to me, this was very much an important change, but it was quite vague and at the time, and also new, and this was a journey. This was a journey towards getting this concept accepted and understood.
What's another striking feature of this email is that you haven't set out, even in high-level terms, the omissions that have been picked up by Cutbill, Hughes, and indeed yourself. Can you help the panel as to why, even in high-level terms, you hadn't flagged up those omissions to members of your team with whom you'd be working on 3.2?
I think, I can't say this for 100% certainty, but I'm very confident all three of those individuals would have known certainly about Kevin Hughes's document, and I don't know whether they'd have been aware of Gary Dobson's document, but they might have been. So I think that these were people who were dealing with this subject very frequently, and therefore there is an assumption here of a level of knowledge that, you know, I didn't feel the need to make that very explicit.
You don't need to articulate those matters on each and every occasion, is what you're saying?
Yes.
Can we look at the penultimate paragraph on this page, which says this: obviously, before this goes for national consultation, the GRA will be sanctioned by AC Knighton and Gary Dobson, but before I pass it to them for approval, I would welcome your views. Now, as far as you were concerned at the time, subject to any views expressed by Ettridge, Alden Smith and Porter, was the draft ready to go out for at least the first round of consultation?
It's a long while ago, and you're asking me what was my level of confidence with the document at this particular time. I don't think I would have shared it in the way that I have if I didn't think it was a reasonable first draft. But to be clear, I knew it hadn't benefited from other fire services input, so I had no idea. I had no perception that it was complete, but I think I felt it was a reasonably mature draft.
So with some hesitation, you were content for it to be subject to at least the first round of consultation?
Yes.
Now, if we can look at the draft that you did attach to this email, which can be found at LFB 00102338. Draft, slightly obliquely watermarked there, but if we can turn to page 14, and this is the section entitled Evacuation and Fire Survival Guidance, FSG calls. I think that is the new section that you were referring to earlier in your evidence, is that right?
It's one of the new sections, yeah.
And apologies, it's probably useful for me to read this for people following it outside, but also so just to refresh your memory. The first subheading says Evacuation and Fire Survival Guidance, FSG calls. FSG calls can be particularly prevalent during a high-rise incident, and the IC will need to prioritise these calls by taking any action necessary to either rescue or reassure building occupants. The IC should normally follow any evacuation plan devised as part of the occupier's fire risk assessment, unless the fire situation dictates otherwise. In residential buildings, occupants should only evacuate if the fire or smoke is in their property. Firefighting operations can be adversely affected by the type of evacuation being undertaken, the progress of the evacuation, and the number of type of people being evacuated. Evacuation can be made more resource intensive if the occupants have an impaired ability to make their own way to safety. the IC should consider the effect of firefighting tactics on evacuation and vice versa, using other emergency service personnel to assist with evacuation, and that widespread evacuation may divert crews from the tasks they were briefed to undertake, and this may require additional resources. Now, just looking at what is said here about FSG calls, you say, well, the draft states, FSG calls can be particularly prevalent during a high-rise incident, and the IC will need to prioritise these calls by taking any action necessary to either rescue or reassure building occupants. Can you explain what you meant by FSG calls being, or potentially being, particularly prevalent?
I can indeed. I think I'm right in saying at this time, LFB was the only fire service that had a fire survival guidance policy. I'm not sure if it had been published, it certainly was in draft, for personnel on the ground. So fire services had guidance for their control staff, but they didn't have guidance for their operational staff that were attending the incident. So I played some part in the definition of that policy, and I actually attended one of the incidents where we'd had multiple fire survival guidance calls, so I had some direct appreciation of the challenges of dealing with that. And I think it's fair to say in London, all of the fire survival guidance calls we'd had, certainly all the multiple fire survival guidance calls we'd had been in high-rise buildings. So,
and if I could, apologies for interrupting you, Ms. Cowup, when you describe multiple FSG calls, can you give the panel a rough idea, an approximate idea of the numbers that you're thinking about there?
So the incident that I attended was in Poplar, and we had 36 calls. And that was prior to that policy being in place. So what we did there was instrumental in the subsequent policy in terms of putting practice into policy terms. Obviously, Lacanau, we had multiple fire survival guidance calls there. I believe we had multiple calls to Madingley as well. But I think we've only had multiple calls on about 4 or 5 occasions.
And I think I'm right in saying that a key feature, indeed a learning point from LACNOR, had been the occurrence of multiple FSG calls at the same instant and the consequential challenges that pose for control room staff. Is that right?
Absolutely. And, well, not just control room staff, but staff on the ground as well.
And would it flow from all of that the number of multiple FSG calls at a high-rise incident and the consequential burden that places on control room to manage those effectively and efficiently was a matter for consideration as part of the GRA 3.2 process?
To be fair, the GRA was the whole GRA series, not just 3.2, was very much focused on operational personnel and what happens at the incident. But I think when you read GRA 3.2, there is an acknowledgement of the key role that brigade control play and control room staff in terms of managing, and that interplay and exchange of information being key when you're dealing with fire survival guidance calls.
Now, in the second part of the sentence we're looking at, the draft states that the incident commander will need to prioritise these calls by taking any action necessary to either rescue or reassure building occupants. In practical terms, what did you have in mind when you referred to prioritising those calls?
What I have in mind there is that saving life always comes first. So it may well mean in the short term that resources are redeployed towards rescue and reassurance. I think that's a really important point. That's there for a reason. Often people are actually relatively safe where they are, but they're very concerned, and understandably so. So firefighters need to act to give them that reassurance that actually they are safe to stay where they are and that the fire is under control or being brought under control.
Now, looking at the phrase action necessary to either rescue or reassure building occupants, did you consider whether guidance needed to be provided about when it would be appropriate for an incident commander to issue orders for the rescue of FSG callers, and when it would be appropriate to reassure callers?
I mean, you're at a very granular level of detail there, and I think the difference between rescue and reassurance in reality on the ground is fairly clear cut. So people need rescuing when they are in smoke or being affected by smoke and fire. I would see reassurance as being in the situation where they're not in any immediate danger, but they are understandably concerned by what they're seeing or what they're hearing, and therefore they require some advice and support, but they don't require rescue. Rescue is where you physically need to assist someone to leave the premises or to move them to a place of relative safety.
Put differently, and apologies if this is insufficiently qualified, but essentially incident commanders know it when they see it, what they ought to do.
Yes, and not just incident commanders, but firefighters as well.
Now, reassuring callers was an issue that was specifically identified in the LFB's own internal investigations in relation to the actions taken by Control Room at Lacknell. Now, the LFB's Lacknell Control Report was published in November 2012 for the purpose of the Lacknell inquests, and it noted that control room operators who had taken FSG calls had a clear expectation that fire crews would reach the callers quickly, and that this carries the risk that the control room operator moves too quickly to reassure the caller that they will be rescued. Now, the reference for that is para 293 of the Lacknell Control Report, which is at HMO quadruple 01124/50. Now, we can go to it if you want to, but does that ring true to you?
It does. I think I go back to my basic distinction between a rescue and a reassurance.
You've made that point. It's just looking at that particular quotation from the control report. At the time you're working on the draft of the GRA, were you aware of that particular danger of providing reassurance to callers that something was being considered by LFB control arising out of Lacknell?
No.
Had you spoken to anyone in LFB control about this particular section of draft 3.2 and sought to discuss with them the way you intended to address FSG calls and their management?
I hadn't, certainly at this stage, I hadn't personally spoken to anyone in control, but as you track through the iteration of this document, the consultation included control representatives.
Can you help us as to why you didn't consult LFB control for the purposes of this first mature draft that was going to be subject to consultation?
Because it was based on work we'd already done to create the fire survival guidance call policy, which had been based very much on a joint effort with control room staff. So I was comfortable that what I was saying there in that section of the document was wholly in accordance with what had been agreed with control to create what I think at this time would have been the draft of the FSG policy.
Looking back at the draft text we've got on the screen, do you agree that there's no reference there to stay put?
I do.
Can you help us as to why there was no reference to stay put there?
I can. Stay put is a design strategy particularly applied to residential buildings. This document and LFB's 633 policy were both very clearly about high-rise buildings in their totality. So it didn't seem appropriate to mention stay put as one option of many, because otherwise we would also need to mention phased evacuation, zonal evacuation, and all the other strategies that could be encountered by firefighters at an incident. So it was to keep the policy, and particularly national guidance to keep it suitably generic.
Put bluntly, it was a conscious decision, am I right in saying, not to refer to stay put when you drafted this section?
At this time it was, and again I'm jumping ahead so you'll probably correct me, but when CLG suggested that stay put should be mentioned and we had a discussion around it, I entirely understood their point of view and we made that change straight away.
We'll come on to that in due course, as you anticipate, Mr. Cowup.
Absolutely.
Now, looking at the second paragraph of this section, it says this: the IC should normally follow any evacuation plan devised as part of the occupier's fire risk assessment, unless the fire situation dictates otherwise. In residential buildings, occupants should only evacuate if the fire or smoke is in their property. Now, what circumstances were you anticipating when you used the phrase fire situation dictating otherwise?
Primarily an escalating fire that was spreading beyond the compartment or the location of origin, so the floor of origin or a part of it if it was a larger building.
That would prompt an evacuation?
Not necessarily an evacuation, but would prompt, as I said earlier, if you come away from the planned evacuation, you've really only got two options. So that would either be a partial evacuation, which might well be, and again, it very much depends on the building and its layout, but it might well be the fire floor, the floor above, possibly the floor above that. But it would very much depend on what you know, the signs and symptoms that you were seeing. And if you could see the fire spreading further than that, you would clearly need to extend the evacuation zone and indeed possibly go for a full evacuation.
For the purposes of drafting this particular text, did you consider whether you needed to provide specific or detailed guidance on the type of situations that might require an incident commander to depart from an existing evacuation plan, or how an incident commander should go about making that decision?
I think, as I've said before, I fully acknowledge that our consideration of evacuation at this time was something of a blind spot. There was no national guidance to cover it. I think we made progress if you compare this with what was in the version 2, but I don't think we went far enough. I think it might help the inquiry if I just draw a distinction between policy and training at this stage, because you keep referring to how.
I think if we can come on to these, there are other matters we want to come on to in due course, but is the blunt fact that giving specific advice on the lines I suggested, it just wasn't considered at this stage for the reasons you've given?
Correct.
Now, it's correct, I think I'm right in saying, that there was no more detailed guidance in the LFB's policy 633, either the version that was in force at the time of the review, or indeed the version that was in force at the time of Grenfell, as to how incident commanders should make the decision to depart from a building's existing evacuation plan. Is that a fair point to make?
It is a fair point to make, but the point I was trying to make just now was that there's a subtle distinction, subtle but important distinction, between what and how, and policy is very much concerned with what, so a statement of what you should do, and training is where we set out how you would do it, if that helps.
It does, and we'll come on to those matters in due course. Now, looking at the second sentence of this paragraph in the draft GRA, it says this: in residential buildings, occupants should only evacuate if the fire or smoke is in their property. Was that intended to be a tangential or oblique reference to stay put?
Clearly it is, because it's embodying the principle. I think that was in there because I think that reflected LFB's policy at the time, and the information we were sharing through our partners, particularly with landlords, as to what we would expect occupants in residential buildings to do. So that was simply reflecting LFB's position at that time in relation to that issue.
Now, you say that, but under the guidance that existed at the time, Residents were told to stay put unless they were, quotes, affected by heat and smoke in their flat. Would you accept that?
I would, and the word heat's missing. It would be far better to use the word products of combustion on reflection, because that covers everything.
It's not quite the same thing as what's set out there, though, is it?
What,
Even allowing for the omission of reference to heat.
What the heat?
Because the guidance at the time said affected by heat and smoke, that they should only evacuate in those circumstances. That's somewhat different to only evacuating if fire or smoke is in their property. Would you accept that?
I accept the point that you're saying that doesn't necessarily say affected by it, saying it's in there. I mean, if it's in their property, it almost certainly will affect them. So it's kind of by default, it would affect them. But I accept it doesn't use the words affect.
And so that last sentence doesn't properly or accurately reflect the guidance that was given at the time, does it?
To the extent it doesn't use the word affect, I'd accept that, yeah. But I do think it's implicit and fairly intuitive from the sentence that if you're in a flat where there's a fire, you need to leave.
There's been quite a lot that's implicit or intuitive thus far in the guidance, though, isn't there? There's not much, when we come down to these details, that's expressly set out.
All of these documents are written for professional firefighters and incident commanders. So there is inevitably some level of assumption in what we think people will understand. But I accept that in certain respects, and this is probably one of them, we could have been more explicit.
But it's not clear that if the fire is outside your flat, but you are affected by heat and smoke, you should leave.
I accept that.
The text does not advise that it may become necessary for stay put advice to be changed during an incident. Can you help us as to why not?
Sorry, can you repeat that?
Of course. The text does not advise that it may become necessary for stay put advice to be changed during an incident, depending on how the fire progresses. Can you help us as to why not?
I accept it doesn't here, but I think when we look at a later draft, that point has been addressed. So in this fairly early draft, we didn't explicitly state that. It's implicit again in the first sentence that if the fire situation dictates otherwise, you would need to change the plan, but I accept it doesn't explicitly state that.
Now, we know, as you intimated, this is a section of the text that was amended before publication. But I'd like to ask you whether you had in mind, at the time that you circulated this draft, the need for incident commanders continue to keep under review the advice being given to residents at a high-rise fire, and whether that advice needed to change at any point depending upon the behaviour of the fire.
Well, as summed up in that second paragraph, me and others that were involved in this certainly recognised the fact that when a fire escalates, it may be necessary to change the advice and to ask people to leave.
In reality, is it blunter than that, that at the time of drafting, neither you nor your team had it in your mind that there may be a need to change stay-put advice?
No, I don't accept that. I think we did understand it. It was a clear lesson identified from Lacanau, and whilst I accept the paragraph you pointed to is not as explicit as it could be, I think that people would have taken from it the fact that you may need to change the preordained evacuation strategy if and when the situation makes that appropriate.
Now, could we go to another element of this draft, GRA 3.2, and that's on page 9, and it's within the section Competence and Training. I think the highlighting indicates that it was another change that you executed. Is that right?
Yes, I think what that highlighting refers to is, and it was something myself and London Fire Brigade brought to the GRA process more generally, which is the fact that all of the documents, all 40 of the GRAs, had a number of common elements to them, competence and training being one of them. And my suggestion to Derek Clough, which he adopted, was that we should have what I term standard text, so that we
to ensure consistency.
To ensure consistency. And I think the fact that's highlighted in yellow, that looks to me like one of the earlier drafts of what we come to use as standard text. So this might have applied in every GRA, that's what I'm saying.
Thank you. Now, if we could look at the list that starts at the bottom of page 9 and starts with the phrase training for high-rise incidents should include. And then it goes on to say in the second bullet point, recognition of the signs and symptoms of backdraft, the effects of wind, risk of fire spread, and the adoption of appropriate tactics to mitigate these. What was your reasoning for including this direction about high-rise training? Were you intending to refer specifically to the need to train firefighters to be able to identify fire spread beyond the compartment of origin?
Yes.
Why not say so explicitly?
I'm not sure I understand the question.
Well, why not say, for example, in the words I put to you, there is a specific need to train firefighters to be able to identify fire spread beyond the compartment of origin?
I haven't really got an answer for that. I mean, I think what's there says much of that. It may not mention compartment of origin, but it talks about fire spread.
You referred to training earlier on and the link between policy and training. Did that particular sentence prompt you to consider what training the LFB needed to provide to its firefighters to identify or to be aware of the risk of fire spread from the compartment of origin?
Yes, because a clear lesson from Lacanau, but other incidents as well, is that when you're fighting a fire in a high-rise building, there is a good possibility it will leave the compartment of origin.
Now, at the time you were drafting this mature draft, albeit the first one, did you have a view as to whether the LFB's training was providing its firefighters with sufficient knowledge to be aware of the risk of fire spread from compartment of origin?
I can't, at this precise time, I can't recollect with any accuracy what LFB's high-rise training package said. I would expect it to have said something around the risk of spread. I think it was updated, certainly in the light of the November 11, 2011 policy. But when it was updated, I can't be certain. So at this particular point in time, I can't really give you a definitive answer to your question.
Do you remember any general concerns as to whether LFB's training addressed sufficiently the awareness of its firefighters to spot the risk of spread beyond the compartment of origin?
I remember very clearly that as a result of Lacanau, we were very attuned, as a brigade, we were very attuned to those risks. And I believe through various training packages, I mean, there was the Lacanau case study, for example, and I think that very much covered fire spread and alternative tactics.
Now, I don't need to go to it for these purposes, but you received limited feedback from Ettridge and Porter, is that right? As a result of which you slightly updated the draft before it was then forwarded to AC Knighton and Mr. Dobson, Gary Dobson.
I'm sure that's correct.
Can you help us? Jim Knighton was head of operational policy at the time. At this moment, what was Gary Dobson's role?
Gary Dobson was the director of, I think it was called Resilience and Training at this time.
Thank you. And then they gave you sign-off and you forwarded the draft to Derek Clough, is that right?
Yes.
And then he initiated the first round, the regional round of consultation.
Correct.
Thank you. So it's 1 o'clock. That concludes at least questions on this stage of matters.
All right, good. So that's a convenient point at which to break, isn't
It is, sir.
Yes, well, Mr. Cowup, it's time we had a break so we can all get some lunch. So we'll break now. We'll resume, please, at 2 o'clock. And again, please don't talk to anyone about your evidence or anything relating to it while you're out of the room.
Okay, sir.
All right? Thank you very much indeed.
Thank you.
Yes, please go with the usher, yes. Thank you, Mr. Kinnear. 2 o'clock,
Thank you.
please. Thank you.